The black sedan screeched around the corner, tires biting into wet asphalt as gunfire cracked through the narrow Tokyo alley. Haruto Saito ducked behind a concrete pillar, blood soaking through his sleeve, his breath ragged. 3 of his men lay motionless behind him. Ahead, through a haze of smoke and rain, he could see her Zuri, bound to a chair inside a warehouse, a gun pressed to her temple by a man who worked for his enemy. Haruto's jaw tightened. 10 years of silence, of sacrifice, of watching from the shadows, had led to this single, unbearable moment. He rose, stepped into the open, and raised his hands. "Let her go," he said, voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You want me, take me instead." The rivals' men laughed, but their leader, Ryu Kuroda, stepped forward with a cruel smile. The great Haruto Saito, begging for a bakery girl, how the mighty have fallen. Haruto's eyes flicked to Zuri. She was staring at him, terrified, confused, and something else, recognition, buried under years of hurt. He would explain everything, if he lived long enough. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, we must go back. Back to the beginning, before the empire, before the blood, before the lie that saved her life. 10 years earlier, Zuri Thompson was 19 years old, living with her grandmother in a small apartment above a noodle shop in Tokyo. She had moved to Japan as a child, and though she sometimes felt like an outsider, she had built a life here, friends, a job at a local cafe, and a dream of opening her own bakery one day. She was warm, funny, and hardworking, with a kind of quiet determination that made people trust her instantly. Her grandmother often teased her that she smiled too much for someone carrying so many long shifts, but Zuri only laughed it off. "Smiling is free," she'd say. "Might as well spend it." It was at that cafe where she met him. Haruto Saito, 22, quiet, always alone at the corner table, nursing black coffee and reading. He never smiled much, but when Zuri brought his order, he always said thank you like he meant it, a small thing. But it stood out among customers who barely looked up from their phones. "You're here every day," she said one afternoon, setting down his cup. "Same seat, same order, you're a creature of habit." "Is that a bad thing?" he asked. "Depends. Are you hiding from something?" He looked up at her, surprised by the question. "Maybe," he admitted. "Aren't we all hiding from something?" She laughed, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in years. He didn't know it yet, but that laugh would follow him for the next decade, through boardrooms, through gunfights, through every cold and lonely night that came after. They began talking more, small conversations that stretched longer each time. He told her he worked as a mechanic. He didn't tell her about his father, about the empire his family controlled from the shadows, about the weight he carried simply by being born a Saito. He wanted for once to be just a man to someone, and with Zuri he was. "You don't talk about your family much," she said one evening, as they sat on a bench watching the river lights shimmer. "There isn't much to say," he lied. "My father and I don't see things the same way." "That sounds heavy." "It is." He looked at her, and for a moment his guard slipped just slightly. "But I don't want to talk about him tonight. I'd rather talk about your bakery dream. Tell me again, the one with the blue awning." She lit up instantly, describing shelves of milk bread and strawberry shortcake, a bell above the door, her grandmother sitting by the window every morning with her tea. Haruto listened like it was the most important information in the world, because to him, in that moment, it was. Their romance grew slowly, tenderly. Cheap ramen shared at midnight, slurped too fast because they were laughing too hard to eat properly. Rainy afternoons spent doing nothing at all, just sitting under one umbrella because neither of them wanted the excuse to leave. There was no luxury in their love, no grand gestures, only 2 people finding comfort in each other amid lives that felt too heavy to carry alone. One evening, beneath a canopy of blooming cherry blossoms, Haruto took her hand. His palms were sweating, which she found strangely endearing, since he never once seemed nervous about anything else. "Zuri," he said, "I don't know what my future holds. There are things I have to face, things I can't explain yet. But I need you to know, whatever happens, whatever it takes, I will come back for you." She searched his face, worried. "Haruto, you're scaring me. What things?" "Just trust me," he said, pressing something into her palm. a silver necklace, delicate and old, clearly a family heirloom. "This belonged to my mother. I want you to have it. Wear it and know that no matter how long it takes, wait for me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'll wait forever if I have to." "Don't say that," he whispered, pulling her close. "Say you'll wait until I come back, because I will come back." She nodded, clutching the necklace to her chest. "I promise." "Say it again," he said, only half joking, his voice thick. "I promise, Haruto Saito. I'll be right here." He kissed her forehead, and for one suspended moment, everything felt certain. The petals falling around them like the world itself was blessing the vow. Neither of them knew it would be the last peaceful night either of them would have for 10 years. The next morning, he was gone. No note, no call, no explanation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Zuri wrote letters, dozens of them, to the address he'd once mentioned in passing. None were answered. She asked around the neighborhood, but no one seemed to know where the quiet mechanic had gone. It was as though he had vanished from the earth, swallowed whole by whatever secret he'd been carrying. "Maybe he found someone else," her grandmother said gently one evening, watching Zuri stare blankly at her cold tea. "Maybe it's time to let go, sweetheart." "He promised," Zuri whispered. "He promised he'd come back." "Promises are easy to make," her grandmother said. "Harder to keep. Don't let a promise chain you to a ghost." "He's not a ghost," Zuri snapped, then immediately softened, ashamed of her own sharpness. "I'm sorry, Grandma, I know him. I know what I felt. People don't fake something like that." "No," her grandmother agreed sadly. "But sometimes people mean every word, and life takes them somewhere they can't come back from anyway. Meaning it and keeping it aren't always the same thing." Zuri wanted to argue, wanted to defend him, but as the months became years, doubt crept in like ivy, choking her hope. She stopped writing letters. She stopped watching the door of the cafe for him. She threw herself into work instead, saving every coin until she had enough to open a small bakery. A dream she'd once shared with him, now built alone, brick by brick, flower bag by flower bag. She never married. She told herself it was because she was busy, because the bakery demanded everything she had. Suitors came and went, a kind accountant, a persistent, regular customer, even a friend of her grandmother's who insisted his nephew would make a fine husband. She turned every one of them down gently, unable to explain even to herself why nothing ever felt right. But late at night, alone in her apartment above the bakery she'd built with her own trembling hands, her fingers would drift to the silver necklace she never removed, and she would wonder if he ever thought of her at all. Some nights she hated him for it. Most nights, she simply missed him, which felt worse. What Zuri didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was the truth unfolding in the shadows of Tokyo's underworld. The night after he left her, Haruto received a phone call that shattered his world. His father, the head of one of Tokyo's most powerful Yakuza families, had been assassinated in a rival attack, gunned down outside a restaurant he visited every Tuesday, a routine so predictable it had become a weakness. The empire he had spent his whole life avoiding was now his, whether he wanted it or not. "You have no choice," Masanori Takeda, his father's most trusted advisor, told him as chaos erupted around them, men shouting orders, phones ringing off the hook, the compound lit up like a war room. "The family needs a leader tonight, or we lose everything by morning. Wars don't wait for grief." Haruto stood in his father's office, staring at the empty chair his father would never sit in again. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of a life he'd spent 22 years running from finally catching up to him in a single, irreversible night. "I have someone," he said quietly. "Someone I need to protect." Masanori's expression softened, just slightly. "Then protect her by staying away. The moment our enemies learn you have a weakness, they will use her against you. It has always been this way. Your father's own brother was killed because of a mistress the family didn't know to protect." "I won't abandon her." "You already have," Masanori said, not unkindly. "The question now is whether you abandon her to save her life or keep her close and watch her die in front of you. Those are the only two futures available to you tonight, Haruto. Choose quickly. Grief is a luxury we do not have time for. The words cut deeper than any blade. Haruto spent that first night as boss making the hardest decision of his life. He ordered every trace of his relationship with Zuri erased. Phone records, photographs. Anyone who knew her name was told to forget it, quietly and permanently. He could never see her again, never speak to her, never explain, because even a single visit could paint a target on her back that his enemies would never let fade. He sat alone afterward, in the dark, holding the twin half of her necklace that he'd kept for himself, and allowed himself exactly 10 minutes to grieve the life he would never have. Then he wiped his face, stood up, and became someone else entirely. But he couldn't simply let her go, not entirely. Every year on her birthday, an anonymous gift arrived at her door. Never anything extravagant enough to draw suspicion, always practical, always exactly what she needed without her ever asking. When her small bakery struggled to pay rent during its first difficult winter, a mysterious investor quietly covered the debt through 3 layers of shell companies. When men from a rival gang once tried to shake her down for protection money, believing her an easy target, they vanished from the neighborhood within a week and never returned. She never understood why she was so fortunate. She never knew that somewhere across the city, a man who loved her was spending his fortune and his power just to keep her safe, watching her build a life he could admire but never enter. In his office, high above the city, Haruto kept only 3 personal items amid the cold luxury of his new life. A photograph of Zuri laughing, taken in secret before everything fell apart, the matching half of the silver necklace he'd given her, and a growing box of letters he wrote to her every year on the anniversary of the day he left, and burned every single time. "Why do you write them if you're only going to burn them?" Masanori asked him once, finding him in his office late at night, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, ash curling in a metal dish on the desk. "Because if I send them," Haruto said, "I'd be lying to her. I'd be asking her to wait for a man who can't promise her anything but danger. And if you never send them, then at least she gets to hate a man who abandoned her, instead of loving one who could get her killed." He looked up at the old man, eyes hollow. "Which do you think is the kinder lie, old friend?" Masanori had no answer for that. He simply placed a hand on Haruto's shoulder and left him to his ashes. 10 years passed this way. Haruto became one of the most feared men in Tokyo's underworld, respected, powerful, untouchable, a name whispered with caution in every rival syndicate from Osaka to Yokohama, and desperately, hollowly lonely. He built an empire with no one to share it with. He won wars he never wanted to fight, in defense of a peace he never got to enjoy. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. A sleek black car pulled up outside Zuri's small bakery, its windows fogged with condensation. She watched from behind the counter as several suited men stepped out, followed by a tall figure in a dark coat. When he stepped into the light spilling from her shop window, her heart stopped. Older, a faint scar along his jaw, a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but it was him. "Haruto," she breathed, the name tasting foreign after 10 years of silence. He stepped inside, the small bell above the door chiming absurdly normal against the weight of the moment. "Zuri." Her hand moved before her mind caught up, and the slap cracked across his face, loud in the quiet bakery. "You abandoned me," she said, voice shaking with 10 years of buried anger. 10 years, Haruto, I waited, I wrote letters, I searched for you. I asked everyone who ever knew you, and it was like you never existed, and you just disappeared." He didn't defend himself, didn't even touch his stinging cheek. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "That's it," her voice cracked. 10 years. "And that's all you have to say to me." "There are things I can't explain right now," he said, his composure a thin shield over something raw underneath. "But I needed to see you, to know you were all right." "All right," she laughed bitterly, the sound closer to a sob. "You wonder if I'm all right after 10 years of silence. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I built this whole life alone, Haruto. Alone." "I know," he said, and something in his voice made her pause, a depth of grief that didn't match a man who was supposed to have simply moved on. But she was too angry, too raw, to notice it clearly. "Get out," she said, tears finally spilling over. "Get out of my shop." He left without another word, and Zuri collapsed against the counter, sobbing for the first time in years over a wound she thought had long since scarred over completely. She might never have learned the truth if not for an accident. A week later, an elderly man, Masanori Takeda, though she didn't know his name, visited her bakery, ordering tea with trembling hands, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long, as though he recognized something in her face he'd only ever seen in photographs. He left in a hurry, forgetting a worn leather folder on the table. Zuri picked it up, intending to return it, but curiosity, and something else, some instinct she couldn't name, made her open it first. Inside were documents, bank transfers spanning 10 years, medical payments for her grandmother's surgery 3 years ago, which she'd always assumed came from an insurance policy she'd forgotten she had. Records of her bakery's rent being quietly subsidized during its hardest winter. Security reports detailing threats against her that had been neutralized, dated, and initialed with clinical precision. Photographs of her, taken from a distance at various points over the past decade, walking to work, laughing with customers, tending to her grandmother in the hospital, blowing out candles on birthdays she thought no one else remembered. And on every single page, one authorization signature. Haruto Saito. Zuri's hands shook as she sat down, the weight of 10 years crashing over her at once. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been watching over her, protecting her, loving her from a distance, the entire time, every single day she'd spent hatting him for something he'd never actually done. She found him that night at a location whispered about only in fearful rumors, a converted warehouse that served as one of his family's meeting places. His men tried to stop her, but something in her desperate expression made them step aside, as though even they could recognize a reckoning when they saw one. Haruto looked up from his desk, stunned to see her standing in his doorway, the leather folder clutched to her chest. "You protected me," she said, voice breaking. "All this time, the gifts, the money, the men who disappeared, it was you. It was always you." He set down his pen slowly, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for 10 years. "Now you know." "Tell me everything," she demanded, stepping closer, refusing to let him retreat behind that same cold composure. "No more secrets, Haruto. I deserve the truth, after everything you let me believe." So he told her, about his father's assassination, about the war that erupted overnight, about Masanori's warning that any contact with her would make her a target that his enemies would never stop aiming at, about the choice he'd made in a single unbearable night to disappear from her life entirely, to let her hate him, so that she could live safely, freely, without ever knowing the danger that shadowed his every step. "I chose your life," he said, his voice raw, cracking in a way she'd never heard from him before, "instead of my own happiness. Every single day for 10 years, I chose it again. Every letter I wrote and burned. Every birthday gift I sent without a name attached. I never expected forgiveness, Zuri. I only ever wanted you safe." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't born of anger. 10 years, she whispered. "You carried this alone for 10 years. "I would carry it for 100 more, he said, "if it kept you breathing." She stepped closer, her hand finding his, trembling. "You should have trusted me with the truth. I could have handled it. I could have helped carry it." "I couldn't risk it," he said. "I still can't. Being near me is dangerous, Zuri. It always will be. That hasn't changed just because you know the truth now." "Then let it be dangerous," she said fiercely, gripping his hand tighter. "I'd rather face danger with the truth beside you than live safely with a lie for the rest of my life. Do you understand that? I would have chosen this. You never gave me the choice." Before he could answer, the door burst open. One of his men rushed in, panic written across his face. "Boss, it's Kuroda's men. They know about her. They took her outside. She's gone." Haruto's blood ran cold as he realized Zuri had been dragged from the doorway moments after stepping in. A decoy. A trap sprung the instant she'd been spotted arriving. The real Zuri, the one standing before him now, had somehow slipped past unnoticed in the chaos. But a woman resembling her, a courier who had been delivering supplies to the warehouse that same evening, had been mistaken for her and seized as she left. The truth hit them both at once. The enemy no longer needed proof of a relationship. Rumors had reached them regardless, carried on the same whispers that traveled through every underworld faction in the city, and now they intended to use anyone connected to Haruto as leverage, proof or no proof. "We have to move," Haruto said, gripping Zuri's shoulders, his voice suddenly sharp with command. "Now, before they realize their mistake and come for you directly, get her somewhere safe," he barked at his men. "Now." But it was too late. Within the hour, reports confirmed Zuri herself had been taken from a secondary location, grabbed by a second team, while the first created the diversion at the warehouse. Ryukyurota's syndicate had finally found their weapon against the untouchable Haruto Saito, and they had planned for exactly this contingency. His advisors gathered around him within the hour, faces grim in the harsh light of the war room. "Let her go," one elder urged. "A boss cannot negotiate from weakness. If you go after her, you confirm exactly what they suspect, that she matters to you. You hand them the very leverage they're trying to create. Cut your losses. It is the only path that keeps the family standing." "Then let them have it," Haruto said, voice like iron, rising from his chair with a finality that silenced the room. "I've spent 10 years pretending she didn't matter. 10 years of letters I burned instead of sent. I won't pretend anymore, not even to save this family's precious appearance of strength. Prepare the men." "We move within the hour." Masanori, silent until now, finally spoke, his old voice heavy with something like regret. "I protected her in secret for a decade, boy, because I believed love and duty could not coexist in our world. I helped you build that lie brick by brick, telling myself it was mercy. I was wrong. Go get her. And this time, don't let her go, whatever it costs." Which brings us back to that rain-soaked alley, gunfire echoing off concrete walls, Haruto standing wounded and unarmed before Ryukyurota, offering himself in exchange for the woman he loved. "Take me instead," he repeated, louder this time, loud enough for Zuri to hear him over her own ragged breathing. Kurota studied him for a long moment, savoring the power he held over a man who had never once shown weakness in 10 years of rivalry. "Sentiment," he said finally, "is a weakness I intend to exploit fully. You should have let her go the moment your father died, Saito. Instead, you handed me the one thing that could finally bring you down." He gestured, and his men dragged Zuri forward, guns still trained on her temple. "Haruto," she cried out, her voice breaking through the smoke. Don't you dare trade yourself for me." "I already did that once," he called back to her, never taking his eyes off Kurota. 10 years ago, I'm not doing it the coward's way this time." What followed was chaos. Haruto's reinforcements arriving just as Kurota's men opened fire, smoke and shouting, and the deafening crack of gunfire filling the alley from every direction. Haruto moved through it like a man with nothing left to lose, fighting his way toward Zuri as loyal men fell around him, bullets tearing past close enough to feel their heat, until finally he reached her, cutting her restraints with shaking, bloodied hands as she sobbed his name over and over. The final confrontation with Kurota was brutal, brief, and decisive. Two men who had spent a decade circling each other finally settling it with nothing but fists, steel, and desperation. Haruto emerged victorious, though badly wounded, collapsing to his knees the moment the threat was neutralized, Zuri catching him before he hit the ground, pressing her palms hard against the wound in his side. "Stay with me," she begged, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "You don't get to leave me again, Haruto Saito. Not after everything. Not after 10 years. Do you hear me? Stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, managing a faint, exhausted smile despite the pain. "I told you, I always come back." The following weeks were the hardest of her life, sitting at his bedside through fevers and surgeries, holding a hand that had spent 10 years protecting her from a distance, now finally close enough to hold. Masanori visited often, quietly relieved, watching the two of them with the expression of a man who had finally seen a debt repaid. Months later, after his recovery, after the dust of the underworld war finally settled, and the surviving factions scattered or surrendered, Haruto made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He began dismantling much of the criminal empire his father had built, transferring legitimate businesses to trusted leadership, slowly stepping away from the violent world that had kept him from the woman he loved for a decade. "Are you sure about this?" Masanori asked him one evening, watching the younger man sign the final transfer documents, the office quieter now than it had been in 10 years. "I spent 10 years protecting her from a distance," Haruto said, setting down the pen. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life protecting her up close for a change. I think I've earned that much, and so has she." Masanori nodded slowly, something like pride crossing his weathered face. "Your father would have hated this decision," he said. "I think he also would have envied it." On a hill overlooking the city, beneath cherry blossoms in full bloom, the same hill where he had once made her a promise 10 years before Haruto knelt before Zuri, holding the same silver necklace that had never left her neck. "I kept waiting too," he said softly. "Every single day, every letter I burned was really just another way of waiting." Zuri smiled through fresh tears, the ache of 10 lonely years finally easing into something like peace. "I know," she whispered. "I know now." She helped him to his feet, and together they walked down the hill, away from the shadows that had once separated them, toward a future finally free from the fear that had shaped their past. No longer a promise whispered under falling petals, but a life they would finally get to build side by side. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us what part hit you hardest. Share it with someone who believes true love waits. See you in the next story.